There is a moment in war when the mathematics of survival collapse entirely, when one man stands between catastrophe and deliverance with nothing but a jammed machine gun, a blade in his hand, and a choice that cannot wait. On a jungle ridge in the South Pacific, in the blackest hours before dawn, Sergeant John Basilone made that choice again and again, until his hands bled and his body threatened to quit, and the enemy kept coming in waves that should have buried him. What happened that night defied every calculation of human endurance, and when the sun finally rose over Henderson Field, 38 Japanese soldiers lay dead within 100 yards of his position. This is the story of how one Marine held a line that could not be held, and why the memory of that night would follow him to another beach, another battle, and a grave he would never leave. John Basilone did not come to Guadalcanal searching for glory. He came because the Marine Corps sent him, because Henderson Field needed defending, and because someone had to man the Browning M1917 machine guns that formed the last layer of protection between the Japanese Imperial Army and the most strategically vital piece of real estate in the South Pacific Theater. He was 26 years old in October of 1942, a product of Raritan, New Jersey, a former Army soldier who had served in the Philippines before joining the Marines, a man who understood weapons the way some men understood engines or the movement of water. He was not tall or imposing in the Hollywood sense. He stood 5 feet 8 inches, weighed 165 pounds, and possessed the wiry, relentless strength of men who grew up working with their hands. His face was unremarkable except for the eyes, which held the flat, measuring quality of someone who had already decided what he was willing to endure. The Browning M1917 was not a weapon for men who needed rest. It weighed 93 pounds with the tripod, 41 pounds for the gun itself, 23 for the water jacket that kept the barrel from melting under sustained fire, and the rest for the tripod and various mounting hardware. The gun fired 30 caliber rounds at a rate of 450 to 600 per minute, and when it was working properly, it could saw through jungle vegetation, sandbag emplacements, and human bodies with the methodical efficiency of an industrial machine. The barrel was cooled by water circulating through a brass jacket, and when that water boiled away, the gun would overheat and jam, and when it jammed in the middle of a firefight, you had seconds to clear the malfunction before the enemy closed the distance and killed you. Basilone knew this weapon better than he knew most people. He had stripped it and reassembled it in the dark. He had fired it until his shoulders ached and his ears rang, and the smell of gun oil and burned powder became as familiar as his own sweat. He knew the feel of the feed tray, the sound of a round seating properly, the way the gun would shudder slightly just before a jam if you were paying attention. He knew that the machine gun was not just a tool but a responsibility, because the men on either side of him were counting on that weapon to keep firing when everything else had failed. Henderson Field was the reason the Marines were on Guadalcanal at all. The Japanese had started building an airfield on the northern coast of the island, and if they finished it, they would control the air and sea lanes throughout the Solomon Islands, cutting off Australia from American supply lines and extending their defensive perimeter deep into the South Pacific. The Marines had landed on August 7, 1942, seizing the partially completed airfield in a surprise assault and renaming it after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at the Battle of Midway. Since then, the Japanese had been trying to take it back. They sent naval bombardments that shook the earth and set the jungle on fire. They sent aircraft that screamed out of the sun and dropped bombs that cratered the runway. They sent infantry at night, moving through the jungle in coordinated attacks designed to overwhelm the American positions through sheer weight of numbers and the terrifying discipline of soldiers who had been trained to view death as preferable to failure. The Marines called the island Guadalcanal, but they had other names for it too. Some called it the Island of Death. Others called it simply Hell. By late October, both sides were exhausted. The Marines had been fighting for nearly 3 months in conditions that broke men faster than bullets. The heat was constant and merciless, a wet, suffocating pressure that turned uniforms into sweat-soaked rags and made every movement feel like wading through warm water. The jungle was alive with insects that bit and burrowed and spread disease. Malaria was epidemic. Dysentery was epidemic. Men lost weight until their uniforms hung loose, and their faces looked like skulls wrapped in sunburned skin. Food was scarce and monotonous, usually consisting of captured Japanese rice mixed with whatever could be scavenged or airdropped. Water was rationed. Sleep was a luxury stolen in 15-minute intervals between Japanese attacks or the random detonation of shells from naval guns firing from miles offshore. The psychological toll was worse than the physical. Men went days without seeing the enemy clearly, fighting shadows in the jungle, never certain if the rustling in the undergrowth was wind or infiltrators. The Japanese had a practice of sending small groups forward at night to probe the American lines, searching for weak points, creating confusion, killing sentries with knives or bayonets to avoid giving away their positions. They would scream in English mimicking American voices, trying to lure Marines out of their foxholes. They would call out the names of Marines killed earlier in the day, using information gleaned from captured documents or overheard conversations, a psychological tactic designed to create paranoia and fear. It worked. Basilone commanded a section of machine guns positioned on a narrow ridge overlooking the approaches to Henderson Field. His position was part of a defensive perimeter that stretched for miles, a patchwork of foxholes, sandbag emplacements, and hastily dug trenches connected by communication wires, and the raw determination of men who understood that if the line broke, the Japanese would roll over them and take the airfield, and everything the Marines had bled for would be lost. His sector covered one of the most likely avenues of approach, a stretch of jungle and kunai grass that provided concealment for attacking infantry, until they were close enough to throw grenades or fix bayonets. He had 2 machine guns under his direct control, each positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, each manned by crews of 3 or 4 Marines who had learned to work together in the fluid, instinctive way that combat demands. They were good men, most of them younger than Basilone, most of them scared in the way all sane people are scared when they know death is close and random and inevitable for some but not others. Basilone did not lecture them about courage or duty. He checked their weapons. He made sure they had water and ammunition. He positioned them so they could cover each other if one gun went down. He told them what to expect and what to do when it happened, and he spoke in the flat, unexcited tone of someone describing routine maintenance rather than survival. The Japanese attack began just before midnight on October 24, 1942. Intelligence had warned that something was coming. Patrols had reported movement in the jungle. Radio intercepts suggested a major offensive. The Marines had been on high alert for 2 days, sleeping in their fighting positions, eating cold rations, waiting for the inevitable. When it came, it was not subtle. Artillery rounds began falling on the American positions around 2300 hours, heavy shells that detonated with flat, concussive blasts that shook the ground and sent shrapnel whining through the darkness. The barrage lasted 20 minutes, targeting the forward positions and communication trenches, cutting phone lines, killing and wounding Marines who had no way to fight back except to press themselves into the earth and pray the next round landed somewhere else. Basilone was in his position when the shelling started, lying flat in a shallow trench beside the machine gun, feeling the impacts through the ground, tasting dirt in his mouth, waiting for the barrage to lift because that was when the infantry would come. At 23:47, according to later after-action reports, the first Japanese soldiers emerged from the jungle. They came in a long, ragged line, advancing at a trot, rifles held low, bayonets fixed, moving with the synchronized purpose of men who had rehearsed this attack many times. They were not shouting yet. That would come later. For now they moved in near silence, trying to cover the open ground before the Marines could bring fire to bear. They were perhaps 150 yards away when Basilone saw them, dark shapes against the slightly less dark jungle, visible only because they were moving, and because he had been staring into that darkness for hours, and had learned to detect motion by the way it disrupted the patterns of shadows and starlight. He did not hesitate. He tapped the gunner on the shoulder and pointed, a simple gesture that needed no words. The gunner swung the Browning left and pressed the trigger. The machine gun fired in long, stuttering bursts, each burst lasting 3 or 4 seconds, the tracers arcing out into the darkness like burning red lines that converged on the advancing Japanese infantry. The sound was enormous, a rapid, hammering roar that drowned out everything else, and in the brief flashes of muzzle light Basilone could see the enemy soldiers jerking and falling and diving for cover. The second machine gun opened up a moment later, catching the Japanese in a crossfire, the two guns working together to create an interlocking web of fire that turned the open ground into a killing zone. The Japanese kept coming. Some crawled. Some ran in short, desperate sprints from one piece of cover to the next. Some threw grenades that fell short and detonated harmlessly in the kunai grass. Some made it close enough to fire their rifles, the muzzle flashes bright and brief, and Basilone heard rounds snapping past his head and punching into the sandbags and ricocheting off the metal tripod with high, singing whines. He ignored them. He fed ammunition belts into the gun, helping the assistant gunner keep the weapon supplied, watching the enemy, calculating angles and distances and rates of advance with the cold, automatic precision of someone performing a familiar task under extreme pressure. The Japanese began to scream. It was not the chaotic screaming of panic, but something organized and deliberate, a collective war cry meant to intimidate and overwhelm, and it rose in volume until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. They charged, not in a single wave but in successive rushes, small groups of men sprinting forward while others provided covering fire, leapfrogging toward the American positions with tactics that were sound and aggressive and terrifying in their execution. Basilone kept the gun firing. He could feel the heat radiating off the water jacket. He could smell the burned powder and the hot metal and the strange, coppery odor that might have been blood or fear or just the accumulated filth of combat. His hands moved automatically, guiding the ammunition belt, clearing a minor jam, adjusting the gun's traverse to follow the enemy's movement. The gunner was doing his job well, firing in disciplined bursts, not panicking, not burning through ammunition faster than necessary. The assistant gunner was doing his job well, feeding rounds and keeping count and preparing fresh belts. Everything was working the way it was supposed to work, and that was the only thing that mattered. Then the gun jammed. It happened suddenly, without warning, the way mechanical failures always happen under stress. One moment the gun was firing smoothly, and the next it was silent. The bolt locked back. A spent casing stuck halfway in the chamber at an angle that prevented the action from cycling. Basilone knew instantly what had happened because he had trained for this, because he had experienced it before, because the sound of the failure was as distinct and recognizable as a friend's voice in a crowd. He did not waste time cursing or asking questions. He grabbed the machete from where it hung on his belt and moved to the gun. The Japanese were still advancing. He could hear them shouting, closer now, maybe 75 yards away, close enough that he could see individual figures moving through the grass. The second machine gun was still firing, but it could not cover the entire sector alone, and the enemy was smart enough to recognize when one gun had gone silent and to exploit that gap. Basilone had second, maybe less. He opened the feed tray and saw the stuck casing immediately, wedged at an impossible angle. The brass expanded from heat and pressure until it had fused partially to the chamber walls. There was a tool for this, an extractor that was supposed to pull stubborn casings free, but the tool was not designed for use under fire and would take too long. Basilone made a different choice. He took the machete and inserted the blade carefully into the ejection port, using the flat of the blade as a lever, applying pressure with the precise, controlled force of someone who understood that too much pressure would damage the chamber and too little would accomplish nothing. The casing moved slightly. He adjusted the angle and pried again, feeling the resistance, feeling the brass beginning to give. The Japanese were shouting, and he could hear rounds hitting the sandbags, and he could hear one of the other Marines yelling something he could not make out. He ignored it all. He pried again, and the casing came free suddenly, popping out of the chamber and falling into the dirt. Basilone dropped the machete, slammed the feed tray closed, pulled the bolt back, let it slam forward, and squeezed the trigger. The gun fired. The Japanese were 50 yards away when the machine gun came back to life and cut into them with renewed ferocity, dropping 3 men in the first burst and forcing the others to dive for cover or retreat back into the darkness. That was the first time that night. It would not be the last. The battle settled into a rhythm, a terrible grinding rhythm that had nothing to do with time as normal people measured it. The Japanese attacked. The machine guns fired. The Japanese fell back. The Japanese attacked again. There was no coherent front line, no clear sense of who was winning or losing, only the immediate and desperate mathematics of staying alive from 1 minute to the next. Basilone moved constantly. When one gun position took casualties, he ran to it, dragging wounded men back, repositioning the gun, getting it firing again. When ammunition ran low, he ran to the supply point, loaded his arms and shoulders with belts and cans, and ran back under fire. The machine gun weighed 41 pounds. The ammunition weighed nearly as much. He carried both. He carried them through the darkness, through the explosions, through the sniper fire and the grenade blasts, and the random spray of bullets from soldiers he could not see. He carried them because if he did not carry them, the guns would go silent, and the Japanese would overrun the position, and the men depending on him would die. Around 0100 hours, one of the gun crews took a direct hit from a mortar round. Basilone was 20 yards away when it happened, close enough to feel the blast wave, close enough to be knocked off his feet by the concussion. When he got up, his ears were ringing, and he could taste blood in his mouth, and he could not hear anything except a high, piercing whine that seemed to come from inside his skull. He stumbled to the gun position. 2 Marines were dead, their bodies twisted and broken in ways that made identification difficult in the darkness. A third was wounded, screaming, clutching his leg where a piece of shrapnel had opened it from knee to hip. The gun was on its side, the tripod bent, the barrel still hot enough to burn skin. Basilone grabbed the wounded man and dragged him to cover, yelling for a corpsman, though he could not hear his own voice. Then he returned to the gun. He righted the tripod, testing the legs, bending the damaged section back into something approximating its original shape with brute force and desperation. The gun was still functional. The barrel was intact. The action was dirty but not damaged. He cleared the chamber, reloaded, and got the gun firing again, this time operating it himself because there was no one else left to do it. He fired until the barrel glowed dull, red in the darkness. He fired until the water in the cooling jacket boiled away and the gun began to overheat again. He fired until the Japanese pulled back, leaving their dead sprawled across the ground like discarded mannequins. Then he ran to the water supply and refilled the jacket, burning his hands on the hot metal, ignoring the pain because pain was temporary and the gun not firing was fatal. He ran back to the position and resumed firing. The Japanese attacked again. Somewhere around 0230 hours, the second machine gun malfunctioned, not from a stuck casing but from a broken extractor, the small metal hook that pulled spent casings from the chamber after each round. Without it, the gun could fire 1 shot and then jam. With it, the gun was fully automatic. The part was delicate, prone to failure under sustained use, and irreplaceable in the field under normal circumstances. These were not normal circumstances. Basilone examined the broken extractor, turning it over in his hands, feeling the shape of the failure. Then he did something that no manual had ever suggested and no instructor had ever taught. He took a piece of barbed wire from the perimeter defenses, cut it to length with his knife, bent it into the rough shape of an extractor hook, and installed it in place of the broken part. It was crude. It was improvised. It had no business working. It worked. The gun fired. It fired for the rest of the night. By 0330 hours, Basilone was moving on instinct alone. He had not slept in more than 40 hours. He had not eaten in 12. His hands were blistered and burned from handling hot metal. His shoulders ached from the weight of ammunition. His throat was raw from shouting orders over the noise of gunfire. He was dehydrated to the point where his vision occasionally blurred and his thoughts seemed to arrive a half-second late, as if traveling through heavy fog. None of it mattered. The Japanese were still attacking, and the ammunition was running critically low, and someone had to go back to the supply point and bring more forward. He went. He ran 200 yards through the darkness, through the random fire of snipers who had infiltrated the American lines, through the detonation of grenades and mortar rounds, through the screaming of wounded men, and the shouted orders of officers trying to coordinate a defense that was fragmenting into isolated pockets of resistance. He reached the supply point, grabbed as much ammunition as he could physically carry, and ran back. The ammunition weighed approximately 90 pounds. He carried it across 200 yards of open ground while Japanese soldiers shot at him. He delivered it to the gun positions, dumped the belts and cans on the ground, and went back for more. He made that run 3 times before dawn. The Japanese kept coming. They came in organized rushes. They came in desperate, disorganized charges. They came in small infiltration teams that tried to flank the machine gun positions and attack from behind. They came with grenades and bayonets and satchel charges, and the absolute conviction that they would take Henderson Field or die trying. Most of them died trying. The machine guns cut them down in waves, the tracers drawing bright, lethal lines across the darkness, the sound of the guns merging into a continuous roar that was as much a physical presence as an audible one. Basilone kept the guns firing. When one gun overheated, he moved to another. When a crew was hit, he took over their position. When the ammunition ran low, he brought more. When the guns jammed, he cleared them with whatever tools or improvised solutions he could devise in the moment. He did not think about heroism or medals or history. He thought about keeping the guns firing because if the guns stopped firing, the Japanese would break through and everyone would die. The sky began to lighten around 0530 hours. It was gradual, a slow transition from absolute darkness to a gray, pre-dawn gloom that revealed the battlefield in terrible detail. The ground in front of the American positions was carpeted with bodies. Some were still moving, wounded men trying to crawl back to their lines, their progress marked by dark trails in the dirt. Most were motionless. The kunai grass was trampled flat and burned in patches where tracers had ignited the dry stalks. The air smelled of smoke and blood, and the sickly sweet odor of bodies that had been lying in the heat for hours. Basilone stood beside one of the machine guns, his uniform soaked with sweat and dirt, his hands shaking slightly from exhaustion and adrenaline, his face expressionless. The Japanese had stopped attacking. They had not retreated in the organized, tactical sense, but had simply melted back into the jungle, leaving their dead behind, conceding this particular piece of ground because the cost of taking it had become too high. Officers began moving through the positions at first light, assessing casualties, checking ammunition levels, preparing for the possibility of another attack. They found Basilone still at his gun, still ready, still functioning despite the fact that any reasonable person would have collapsed hours ago. They found the improvised barbed wire extractor. They found the bodies of the Japanese soldiers who had died within 100 yards of his position. They counted 38, though the exact number would be disputed later because some bodies were difficult to identify and some may have been dragged away during the night. They found evidence of everything Basilone had done, the ammunition he had carried, the guns he had repaired, the positions he had held when others could not. They began to understand that they were looking at something extraordinary, not in the sense of superhuman, but in the sense of a man who had performed every task required of him under conditions that should have killed him, and who had kept performing those tasks until the enemy stopped coming. Basilone did not speak much in the hours after the battle. He helped clear the guns. He helped move the wounded. He helped bury the dead, both American and Japanese, because that was what Marines did when the fighting stopped. He accepted water and food and medical attention for his burns with the same flat, distant demeanor he had maintained throughout the night. He did not celebrate. He did not boast. He accepted the thanks of the men around him with brief nods and quiet acknowledgments, and then he returned to his position, because the Japanese might attack again, and someone needed to be ready. The battle for Henderson Field continued for weeks after that night. The Japanese launched more attacks. The Marines held. Basilone fought in several more engagements, always at a machine gun, always in the forward positions, always with the same relentless competence that had characterized his actions on October 24th and 25th. In December of 1942, he was informed that he had been recommended for the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration awarded by the United States government, reserved for actions that go beyond the call of duty and demonstrate conspicuous gallantry at the risk of life. He received the medal in May of 1943, presented by a general in a ceremony that felt alien and uncomfortable to a man who had spent the last year learning to survive in conditions where ceremony and formality had no place. He was promoted. He was sent back to the United States on a war bonds tour, traveling from city to city, giving speeches, shaking hands, being treated as a symbol of American courage and determination. He hated it. He requested permission to return to combat. The request was denied multiple times because the military wanted to preserve him as a public relations asset, a living embodiment of Marine Corps values. He kept requesting. Eventually, they relented. In February of 1945, John Basilone landed on Iwo Jima with the 5th Marine Division. He was now a gunnery sergeant, leading a machine gun section in the assault on one of the most heavily fortified islands in the Pacific. The Japanese had spent months preparing defenses, digging tunnels and bunkers and fortified positions designed to extract maximum casualties from any attacking force. The Marines knew what they were facing. They attacked anyway. Basilone led his men off the beach, moving forward under intense fire, directing the placement of machine guns, coordinating with tank units, doing everything he had always done. On the first day of the battle, he was caught by mortar fire. The wounds were catastrophic. He died quickly, surrounded by the men he had been leading, on a beach thousands of miles from Guadalcanal, but in circumstances that would have been grimly familiar to anyone who had known him. He was 27 years old. He was awarded the Navy Cross posthumously for his actions on Iwo Jima, the second highest military decoration for valor. Combined with his Medal of Honor from Guadalcanal, this made him the only enlisted Marine in World War II to receive both decorations. The distinction meant little to him by then, because he was dead. It meant something to the Marines who had served with him, who understood that his death was not random or meaningless, but the logical conclusion of a life spent moving toward danger when others moved away from it. It meant something to the historians who later studied the battles of Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima and tried to understand how the Marines had prevailed against odds that should have destroyed them. It meant something to the family he left behind, who mourned a son and brother taken too young, but who could at least point to the record of what he had accomplished and find some measure of pride in the grief. The night of October 24th to October 25th, 1942, was not the longest battle of World War II or the deadliest or the most strategically significant. It was one engagement among thousands, a few hours of violence on a jungle ridge that most people could not locate on a map. But for the Marines who were there, for the men who watched John Basilone clear a jammed machine gun with a machete and then keep fighting for 8 more hours until dawn, it was the night they learned what was possible when one man refused to accept defeat. It was the night that demonstrated, more clearly than any speech or propaganda film ever could, that courage is not the absence of fear but the ability to function despite it, that heroism is not a moment but a series of decisions made under impossible conditions, and that some people possess a quality that cannot be taught or trained or replicated, a quality that shows itself only when everything is at stake and failure means death. John Basilone held the line on Guadalcanal because someone had to hold it, and he was the one standing there when the choice needed to be made. He did not do it for glory or recognition or reward. He did it because it was his job, because the Marines beside him were depending on him, because the machine gun was his responsibility and walking away was not an option his mind could process. He paid for that choice with his hands and his health and eventually his life, but the payment was made willingly, and when the reckoning came on a beach at Iwo Jima, he was still moving forward, still leading, still refusing to quit even when quitting would have been the rational choice. That is what makes his story worth remembering, not because he was superhuman, but because he was entirely human, a man who discovered depths of endurance he probably did not know he possessed, and then drew on those depths until there was nothing left to give. If you found this story powerful, if it gave you a new perspective on what courage looks like when everything is on the line, I would be grateful if you would subscribe to this channel and like this video. History like this deserves to be remembered, and your support helps ensure these stories reach others who need to hear them. I am curious to know which moment in this account affected you most deeply. Was it the machete clearing the jammed gun in the middle of an attack? Was it the 90-pound ammunition runs through enemy fire? Was it the barbed wire extractor improvised from battlefield scrap? Or was it something else, some smaller detail that spoke to you about what it means to hold a position when every instinct is screaming to run? Please share your thoughts in the comments. What does this story make you think about courage, about duty, about the kind of person who runs toward danger when everyone else is running away? Thank you for listening, and thank you for keeping the memory of Sergeant John Basilone and all those who served with him alive.